He subsequently bought into the Woodforest National Bank in Texas, a private bank that was in 2010 forced to refund $32 million and pay a $1 million civil fine to settle charges of usurious overdraft fees. Hardcore economic and social conservatives, except for the state subsidies that paid for the Diamondbacks Stadium and brought public transit to the field, the Kendricks were horrified by the election of Obama. They were charter members of the Koch's donor network, having written at least one seven-figure check. Their generosity had been a two-way street. They had supported institutions that the Kochs favored, such as the Institute for Humane Studies and the Mercator Center at George Mason University. The Kochs had meanwhile supported the Freedom Center at the University of Arizona that they founded, where the Kendrick professor of philosophy taught freedom to college students. Now Randy Kendrick wanted to know what the group planned to do to stop Obama from overhauling America's healthcare system. She had read the former Democratic Senator Tom Dashley's 2008 book, Critical: What We Can Do About the Healthcare Crisis, and was alarmed. She warned that Dashley, who favored universal health care coverage, likely reflected Obama's thinking. Dashley was expected to become Obama's Secretary of Health and Human Services. If the new administration adopted a plan of the kind Dashley was floating, she said it would kill business, her patients, and lead to the biggest socialist government takeover in their lifetimes. She was adamant. Obama had to be stopped. What was the plan? Kendrick spoke with passion. Her interest in the issue was both political and personal. She argued that the choice of private health care had saved her from spending the rest of her life confined to a wheelchair after a leg injury. She had initially been told that because she suffered from a rare disorder, she couldn't risk surgery. But a specialist at the renowned Cleveland Clinic had found a successful treatment. She survived the surgery and was now an active mother of teenage twins. Randy was convinced that if America had government health care like Canada or Great Britain, she would be dead, a friend who asked not to be identified confided. It was a powerful testimonial, and the donors at the Cook seminar were deeply moved. But the Obama administration had never proposed government health care like that in Canada or Great Britain. Reached later, after the implementation of Obama's Affordable Care Act, Donald Jacobson, professor of molecular medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, who cared for Kendrick, recalled her as a generous donor but dismissed as nonsense her argument that Obama's health care plan ever threatened treatment of the kind that she received. "I can assure you that Obamacare did not diminish our research efforts in any way," he said. However, the sequestration efforts of the right-wing conservatives and their Tea Party colleagues have hampered progress in medical research. The National Institutes of Health is suffering greatly, and it is very difficult for all investigators to obtain funding. You can't blame the Affordable Care Act, but you certainly can blame the Republicans. Nonetheless, when Kendrick finished her emotional pitch, there was an awkward silence from the Kochs, according to two sources familiar with the meeting. The Kochs of course opposed the expansion of any government social program, including any potential universal health care plan. But the sources said they hadn't focused much on the issue. They had assumed the healthcare industry would fight its own battles, in its own interest, so they hadn't thought they'd need to step in. Instead, the Obama administration had cut deals with much of the healthcare industry, winning much of its support. They were unprepared on the issue, said one of the sources. Despite their later reputation for orchestrating opposition to Obamacare, it was actually Kendrick, not the Kochs, who first led the way. She and a handful of other multimillionaires had recently helped fund an unsuccessful effort to prevent Arizona from coercing citizens into buying government-run, or any other kind of, health care coverage. But Kendrick was not giving up. She was strong-minded and accustomed to getting her way. When she appeared every few weeks at the think tank, a former colleague recalled, they would often line up and hand her a bouquet of flowers, like a queen. After the defeat in Arizona, Kendrick vowed to take her fight national. "Who do I have to give money to?" she asked Sean Noble, a Republican political operative in Arizona who had become her de facto personal political consultant. Kendrick demanded to know, What organizations are doing this, according to an account written by Eliana Johnson for National Review. At Kendrick's request, Noble surveyed the field and found virtually no organization set up in early 2009 to take aim at Obama on the issue. Or at least none that was a 501(c)(4), the IRS code for a tax-exempt social welfare group that can participate in politics so long as it's not the group's primary focus. Unlike conventional political organizations, such nonprofits can hide the identities of their donors from the public, reporting them only to the IRS. Noble knew these so-called dark money groups were especially appealing to wealthy individuals who wanted to influence politics without public attention, like the members of the Cook Network. Noble had attended Cook seminars with his former boss, John Shadegg, a staunchly conservative Republican congressman from Arizona whose father, Stephen, had been Barry Goldwater's campaign manager and alter ego. For over a decade, Noble had worked for Shadegg, eventually becoming chief of staff of the congressman's Arizona office. In 2008, however, Noble decided to go out on his own, opening a political consulting firm, Noble Associates, at his home in Phoenix. Kendrick, who had been a major supporter of Shadegg, was a prized client. She and Noble had worked closely for years. He hadn't been invited to the January Cook meeting where she held forth, but she called him afterward for help. As he set up his business, her interest in launching a crusade against healthcare reform, and her entree into the Cook Network, presented a lucrative opportunity. Noble wasn't a first-string player in Washington's political big league, but he was respected and had a superabundance of charm. Fit and blonde, with just enough gray around his temples to add gravitas to his cherubic features, he was unassuming and fun. Even his political opponents found him hard to dislike. Noble described himself as a Reagan baby who was raised in the tiny town of Show, Arizona, named by card players, where as a boy he started the day listening to the national anthem on the radio with a hand over his heart. His mother, a homemaker, and father, a dentist, were Mormons and believed America was the promised land. In their household, Barry Goldwater was a hero, and Jimmy Carter a villain. When Carter was elected in 1976, Noble's mother warned that the Soviet Union would take over the world. By the time he was in college, Noble was working for conservative candidates, eventually connecting with Shadegg. Along the way, he got married, had 5 children, and became a Mormon bishop in his Phoenix ward. Anti-abortion and libertarian, he voted for Ron Paul in 1988. In many ways, he was a perfect fit for the Cook Network, except for one thing. Noble, who contributed almost compulsively to a personal online blog called Noble Thinking, was chatty. Taking on Obama's healthcare plan with private money would require stealth. On April 16, 2009, Noble and Kendrick began putting their plan in place when the Center to Protect Patient Rights, CPPR, was incorporated in Maryland. Physically, the organization existed only as a locked, metal mailbox, number 72465, inside the Boulder Hills post office at the edge of a desert road north of Phoenix. Later records would show Noble was its executive director. The effort was surrounded in such secrecy that when Noble was asked in a 2013 deposition who hired him, he declined to answer, citing confidentiality agreements. As ProPublica, the nonprofit investigative reporting concern, later reported. Responding to the lawyer's question, he said, "I can't tell you who I do work for." "Wait a minute," the lawyer interjected. "I asked how your salary got set, and you're telling me that you had a discussion with some people in 2009 and you're refusing to tell me who." "I am," Noble answered. The identities of the donors remained opaque, but one thing clear from tax records was that Noble's sponsors had an astounding amount of money. By June, the Center to Protect Patient Rights had accumulated some $3 million in donations. By the end of 2009, the sum reached $13 million. More than $10 million of that was quickly passed on to other tax-exempt groups, including Americans for Prosperity, which soon took a lead in attacking Obama's healthcare plan. By the end of 2010, the sum sloshing through the post office box belonging to the Center to Protect Patient Rights would reach nearly $62 million, much of it raised through the Koch's donor network. The first tangible sign of this underground funding stream was a television ad called Survivor. It featured a Canadian woman named Shona Holmes who said, "I survived a brain tumor," but claimed that if she had been forced to wait for treatment from Canada's government health service, "I'd be dead." Instead, she said, she had received life-saving treatment in Arizona. Fact-checkers later revealed that her dramatic story was highly dubious and that in fact the reason the Canadian health authorities hadn't expedited her treatment was that she actually had a benign cyst on her pituitary gland. Nonetheless, the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, the charitable wing of the tax-exempt organization chaired by David Koch, spent $1 million airing the ad in the summer of 2009. The message was made by Larry McCarthy, a veteran Washington media consultant best known for creating the racially charged Willie Horton ad, which featured the crimes of a convicted African-American murderer on a weekend furlough from prison in Massachusetts. It helped sink the presidential campaign of Michael Dukakis in 1988 by making him look soft on crime. McCarthy was infamous for using manipulative emotional messages, especially fear. As Peter Hart, the Democratic pollster, said of McCarthy, whom he had worked against, and occasionally with, over the years, "If you want an assassination, you hire one of the best marksmen in history." That spring, flush with cash, Noble signed McCarthy up. The Center to Protect Patient Rights wasn't flying blind. At Noble's instigation, that spring the organization had also quietly paid Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster and pitchman, to conduct market testing on the best ways to attack Obama's health care proposal. Luntz's political science professor at Penn had been James Pearson, who later ran the Olin Foundation. Luntz had studied the building of the conservative movement and become something like a translator, interpreting elite opinion for the masses. "The think tanks became the creators of the ideas, and I became the explainer of the thoughts," he said. "Mostly what I do is listen and I process." He admitted that as communicators these guys were impossible. In playing this role, Luntz was one of a long succession of policy entrepreneurs who served to popularize the agenda of wealthy backers by framing their issues in more broadly appealing language. Luntz used polls, focus groups, and instant response dial sessions to perfect the language of healthcare attacks and then tested the lines on average Americans in St. Louis, Missouri. Out of these sessions, Luntz compiled a seminal 28-page confidential memo in April warning that there was no groundswell of public opposition to Obama's health care plan at that point. In fact, there was a groundswell of public support. By far the most effective approach to turning the public against the program, Luntz advised, was to label it a government takeover. He wrote, "Takeovers are like coups. They both lead to dictators and a loss of freedom. I did create the phrase government takeover of healthcare. And I believe it," Luntz maintained, noting too that it gave the Republicans the weapon they needed to defeat Obama in 2010. But most experts found the pitch patently misleading because the Obama administration was proposing that Americans buy private health insurance from for-profit companies, not the government. In fact, progressives were incensed that rather than backing a public option for those who preferred a government insurance program, the Obama plan included a government mandate that individuals purchase health care coverage, a conservative idea hatched by the Heritage Foundation to stave off nationalized health care. Luntz's phrase was so false that it was chosen as the lie of the year by the nonpartisan fact-checking group PolitiFact. Yet while a rearguard of administration officials tried lamely to correct the record, Luntz's deceptive message stuck, agitating increasingly fearful and angry voters, many of whom flocked to Tea Party protests. Noble's strategy was carefully targeted. He aimed the attack ads especially at the states of members of the Senate Finance Committee, which was writing the health care bill and whose support would be needed to vote it out of the committee. The Obama White House had delegated a tremendous amount of authority to the committee's chairman, the Montana Democrat Max Baucus, whom it was entrusting to win bipartisan support. Baucus, in turn, was trying fitfully to win the support of the committee's leading Republican, the Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley. Noble studied the committee and singled out members who might be especially susceptible to pressure, along with a few other key swing votes, narrowing his list down to those from Louisiana, Nebraska, Maine, Iowa, and Montana. With enough pressure, he believed he could even unnerve both Grassley and Baucus. At the time, few thought that Obama's health care plan could be derailed. Conservative opposition was focused more on other issues. Noble needed to generate grassroots pressure on the potentially persuadable senators, but constituents weren't yet engaged. The stakes grew as the Senate approached its summer recess. "We knew we had to make that summer absolute hell," he told National Review. For help, he turned to an old friend in Arizona, Doug Goodyear, whose controversial public relations firm, DCI Group, had truly professionalized the modern use of phony AstroTurf campaigns on behalf of big money interests, starting with the industry that really set the standard for deceptive advertising, tobacco. Goodyear, the firm's managing partner and chief executive, had founded DCI Group in 1996 with two Republican campaign operatives while he was handling outside public relations for the huge tobacco company R.J. Reynolds. The work had shown the trio that ordinary campaign tools could succeed at marketing even the most toxic products. The key, according to an internal 1990 memo the tobacco industry was forced to disclose in a later legal settlement, was to disguise the company's financial interest as a matter of great principle. Instead of pitching cigarette sales, it would create fake smokers' rights groups who would agitate against smoking restrictions as a fundamental matter of liberty. Or, as the memo written by Tim Hyde, one of the three founding partners of DCI Group and at the time R.J. Reynolds' director of national field operations put it, the company needed to create a movement that would build broad coalitions around the issue cluster of freedom, choice, and privacy. The company, Hyde wrote, should proceed along two tracks. One was the intellectual track within the D.C., New York corridor, which could influence elite opinion with op-ed pieces, lawsuits, and expert think tank studies. The other was a grassroots organizational and largely local track, which would use front groups to simulate the appearance of popular political support. Noble knew that by 2009 DCI Group was unsurpassed at these dark arts. The firm had deep ties to the Republican Party and had worked for powerful interests ranging from ExxonMobil and the Teamsters to the military junta in Myanmar. Goodyear was especially versed in corporate lobbying disguised as hidden-hand AstroTurf campaigns. But the firm had numerous other talents. While working for ExxonMobil, it had mocked Al Gore's environmental Jeremiad, An Inconvenient Truth, by secretly launching a cartoon spoof that went viral called Al Gore's Penguin Army. Only later were DCI's fingerprints discovered on the fake indie film. Unlike lobbying firms, which have to disclose some information, public relations firms exerting political pressure can hide the money trail. Soon Noble's Center to Protect Patient Rights was dispersing millions of dollars to other nonprofit groups, some of which appeared to be shell organizations fronting for DCI Group. In June, the Center to Protect Patient Rights sent $1.8 million to a confusingly similar-sounding organization called the Coalition to Protect Patient Rights, which was set up that month in Virginia by an accountant who worked for DCI Group. The Virginia organization soon passed most of the funds on to DCI Group. Pretty soon, a former head of the American Medical Association named Donald Palmisano appeared on the national media circuit to take swipes at Obama's health care proposal on behalf of the newly created coalition. He admitted that donors, whom he declined to name and who were not in the medical field, had recruited him to speak for the group, which called itself a doctor-led coalition. The same DCI Group accountant's name appeared on paperwork filed by another Washington area nonprofit, a tiny organization calling itself the Institute for Liberty. It soon received a $1.5 million grant from Noble's Center to Protect Patient Rights. $400,000 of these funds were channeled back to DCI Group for consulting. The previous year, the Institute for Liberty's entire budget had been $52,000. Suddenly it was so awash in cash that the group's president, Andrew Langer, told the Washington Post, "This year has been really serendipitous for us." He said a donor, whom he declined to name, had earmarked the funds for a 5-state advertising blitz targeting Obama's healthcare plan. Although the Washington Post wrote about the surprisingly large ad campaign, it failed to trace the money back to its true source. On air, the ad's only sponsorship information was completely misleading. There was a line that said, "Paid for by keeping small business healthy." Americans for Prosperity, meanwhile, threw itself headlong into the fight, spinning off a group called Patients United Now, which, according to Tim Phillips, organized more than 300 rallies against the healthcare legislation. At one rally, an effigy of a Democratic congressman was hanged. At another, protesters unfurled a banner depicting corpses from Dachau, implying that Obama's healthcare plan was akin to the Nazis' state-ordered murders. The Bradley Foundation also pitched in. While the tax-exempt foundation did not directly support Tea Party groups, its president, Michael Grebe, said the foundation supported public education programs run by Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works, both of which are very active in the Tea Party. Although Grebe openly described the Koch's group, Americans for Prosperity, as very active in the Tea Party, Fink was still claiming otherwise. "We never funded the Tea Party," he still maintained. "We met for 20 or 30 years advancing free market ideas in universities, think tanks, and citizen groups. I am hopeful those ideas filtered down and were a part of the cause of the Tea Party taking off." By the time of the Koch's second donor summit of 2009, titled Understanding and Addressing Threats to American Free Enterprise and Prosperity, which took place in Aspen, Colorado, at the end of June, Noble had earned his place as an insider. Not only had he been invited, he had been officially put on contract as a Cook political consultant. The Koch's felt they needed extra help, a former insider said, because Obama's election had sparked such vitriol on the right that they were almost overwhelmed by the number of wealthy donors eager to join them. Suddenly they were raising big money. They were in a hot spot. They were almost hyperventilating, he said. This time, instead of having to interrupt the proceedings, Randy Kendrick was a scheduled speaker on a healthcare panel. And this time, the pitch she made to the others, according to one eyewitness, set the place on fire. Before the donors dispersed, many more millions were pledged to stop Obama's top legislative priority. That summer, traditional town hall meetings held by Democratic congressmen and senators returning to their districts and states exploded in acrimony. The anger appeared entirely spontaneous. But the investigative reporter Li Fang discovered that a volunteer with Freedom Works was circulating a memo instructing Tea Partiers on how to disrupt the meetings. Bob McGuffey, who ran a website called rightprinciples.com, advised opponents of Obama's policies to pack the hall, spread out to make their numbers seem more significant, and to rock the boat early in the rep's presentation, to yell out and challenge the rep's statements early, to rattle him, get him off his prepared script and agenda, stand up and shout and sit right back down. While McGuffey was quickly dismissed as a lone amateur, some of the outside agitation was professional, paid for by the Cook Network. Noble later admitted, "We packed these town halls with people who were just screaming about this thing." After a military veteran assailed the Washington Democratic Congressman Brian Baird for ostensibly defiling the Constitution by supporting Obama's universal health care plan, Baird decided to retire from politics, citing the intolerably toxic atmosphere. In Philadelphia, Senator Arlen Specter, a moderate Republican, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, were drowned out by hundreds of booing detractors at an event as they tried to explain the health care legislation. Members of Congress all over the country, in districts as far apart as Tampa, Florida, and Long Island, New York, found themselves ambushed by screaming citizens, some mistakenly believing specious rumors about Obama's plans to create government death panels to euthanize senior citizens. The raucous rallies proved pivotal in eroding Obama's agenda. Grover Norquist, The anti-tax activist who held a weekly meeting for conservative leaders in Washington, including representatives from Americans for Prosperity, described the summer's pandemonium as a turning point. The Republican leadership in Congress, he said, couldn't have done it without August, when people went out on the streets. It discouraged deal makers, like Grassley Republicans who might otherwise have worked constructively with Obama. Moreover, the appearance of growing public opposition to Obama affected corporate donors on K Street, the center of Washington's lobbying industry. K Street is a $3 billion weather vane, Norquist said. When Obama was strong, the Chamber of Commerce said, "We can work with the Obama administration." But that changed when thousands of people went into the street and terrorized congressmen. August is what changed it? As Obama and his family vacationed in Martha's Vineyard during the congressional recess that month, Grassley, who was under bombardment from anti-healthcare ads paid for by the Cook Network, made clear he would not provide bipartisan support. Baucus, whose state noble's campaign was also heavily targeting, dithered and delayed. The death of Senator Edward Kennedy, the liberal Democratic senator who had been the greatest champion of universal health care, cast health care reform under a further cloud. A special election was set for January to fill what was assumed to be his reliably Democratic Senate seat. Jim Margulis, the Democratic political consultant and advertising expert who had created many of Obama's 2008 campaign spots, watched with growing dismay. He had been advising both the White House and Democrats in Congress on the health care issue and had begun with high hopes. "I thought on health care you'd get a modest amount of support from thoughtful Republicans," he said. In March and April, Max Baucus was reaching out to Olympia Snowe and Chuck Grassley. The moderate Republicans were making some of the right sounds. But the progress was slow. Then, over the August recess, it really explodes. "It would be interesting to know what the funding streams were like," he mused. "My suspicion is that the outside forces were kicking into high gear as we moved into the summer." Axelrod later acknowledged that he wasn't really tracking the right-wing money during this period and only belatedly came to realize that there was a set of right-wing oligarchs that found Obama threatening, because he believes in using government to solve problems. It was the Gilded Age all over again. The press, ever alert to a colorful political drama, exaggerated the size of the grassroots groundswell. When fewer than 65,000 Tea Party supporters flocked to the National Mall in Washington on September 12 for Glenn Beck and Freedom Works' 9/12 rally, carrying signs like one reading, "Bury Obamacare with Kennedy," it was treated as if the entire center of gravity in American politics had shifted. To be sure, the numbers on the far right had grown. Membership in the Liberty League, the anti-New Deal corollary to the Tea Party during the 1930s, has been estimated at 75,000, while membership in the John Birch Society in the 1960s has been estimated at 100,000 core members. Overall, at its height, 5% of Americans approved of the John Birch Society. The Tea Party movement, in contrast, was estimated by the New York Times to have won the support of 18% of the population at its zenith, but at its core, according to the researcher Devin Burghardt, were some 330,000 activists who had signed up with 6 national organizational networks. If the estimates were correct, the actual number of hardcore Tea Party activists was not, by historical standards, all that large. But the professionalization of the underground infrastructure, the growth of sympathetic and in some cases subsidized media outlets, and the concentrated money pushing the message from the fringe to center stage were truly consequential. On October 3, as the first anniversary of Obama's election approached, David Cook came to the Washington area to attend a triumphant Defending the American Dream Summit, sponsored by Americans for Prosperity. Obama's poll numbers were falling fast. Only one Republican senator, Olympia Snowe of Maine, was working with the administration on health care, and she would eventually peel off. Aides said Obama was deeply disappointed. By obstructing every initiative, including his most ambitious domestic program, the Republicans had undermined his greatest appeal, his promise to be a bridge builder beyond old partisan divisions. Mitch McConnell, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, held the Republican caucus in line partly by noting that Tea Party forces were ready and waiting to launch primary challenges against any who strayed. The outside groups funded by outside money thus provided crucial leverage. The plan worked so well that by the fall pundits who had fallen over themselves to praise Obama a year before were writing about his political ineptitude. In a speech to a filled ballroom at the Crystal Gateway Marriott in Arlington, Virginia, on that October day, Cook said, "5 years ago, my brother Charles and I provided the funds to start the Americans for Prosperity, and it's beyond my wildest dreams how AFP has grown into this enormous organization." He went on, "Days like today bring to reality the vision of our board of directors when we founded this organization, 5 years ago." Rubbing his hands together somewhat awkwardly, he added, "We envisioned a mass movement, a state-based one, but national in scope, of hundreds of thousands of American citizens from all walks of life standing up and fighting for the economic freedoms that made our nation the most prosperous society in history." Thankfully, the stirrings from California to Virginia, and from Texas to Michigan, show that more and more of our fellow citizens are beginning to see the same truths as we do. As he stood at the lectern beaming, delegates from the various chapters of Americans for Prosperity reported in, one by one, describing how they had organized dozens of tea parties in their regions as they stood beside oversized vertical signs marking their states. Strobe lights crisscrossed the auditorium as excitement surged. It was hard not to notice that 29 years after David Cook left the national political stage in utter defeat, he had succeeded in financing something that looked a lot like a presidential nominating convention, with himself as the winner. Chapter 8. The Fossils. In the final months before the 2008 presidential election, Michael Mann, a tenured meteorology and geosciences professor at Penn State University who had become a leading figure in climate change research, told his wife that he would be happy whichever candidate won. Both the Republican and the Democratic presidential nominees had spoken about the importance of addressing global warming, which Mann regarded as the paramount issue of the day. But what he didn't fully foresee was that the same forces stirring the Tea Party would expertly channel the public outrage at government against scientific experts like himself. Mann had started out unconvinced by the science of climate change, but in 1999 he and two co-authors had published a study tracking the previous 1,000 years of temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere. It included a simple, easy-to-grasp graph showing that the Earth's temperature had hovered in a more or less straight line for 900 years but then shot sharply upward, like the blade of a hockey stick, in the 20th century. What came to be known as the hockey stick graph was so powerfully persuasive it gained iconic status within the climate debate. By 2008, Mann, like most experts, had long since concluded that the scientific evidence was overwhelming that human beings were endangering the Earth's climate by burning too much oil, gas, and coal. The carbon dioxide and other gases these fuels released were trapping the Earth's heat, with devastating effects. As even the Pentagon, a cautious bastion of technological nonpartisanship, concluded, the danger from climate change is real, urgent, and severe. An official U.S. National Security Strategy report declared the situation a growing national security threat, arguing, the change wrought by a warming planet will lead to new conflicts over refugees and resources, new suffering from drought and famine, catastrophic natural disasters, and the degradation of land across the globe. The report unambiguously predicted that if nothing were done, climate change and pandemic disease would directly threaten the health and safety of the American people. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest and most prestigious scientific society, was equally if not more adamant. It warned that we face risks of abrupt, unpredictable, and potentially irreversible changes with potentially massively disruptive consequences. Mann wasn't particularly political. Middle-aged, friendly, and balding, with a dark goatee shadowing his round face, he was a quintessential science nerd who had majored in applied math and physics at the University of California, Berkeley, got advanced degrees in geology and geophysics at Yale, and for many years didn't think scientists had much of a role to play in public policy. When Obama won, he recalls, I shared the widespread view that we would see some action on the climate front. Certainly this assumption seemed reasonable. On the night that Obama clinched the Democratic nomination, he spoke passionately about climate change, vowing that Americans would look back knowing that this was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. Once in office, he pledged to pass a cap-and-trade bill forcing the fossil fuel industry to pay for its pollution, as other industries did, rather than treating it as someone else's problem. Cap-and-trade was a market-based solution, originally backed by Republicans, requiring permits for carbon emissions. The theory was that it would give the industry a financial incentive to stop polluting. It had worked surprisingly well in previous years to reduce industrial emissions that caused acid rain. By choosing a tested, moderate, bipartisan approach, the Obama administration and many environmentalists assumed a deal would be winnable. What we didn't take into account, Mann later noted, was the ferociousness of the moneyed interests and the politicians doing their bidding. We are talking about a direct challenge to the most powerful industry that has ever existed on the face of the earth. There's no depth to which they're unwilling to sink to challenge anything threatening their interests, even if it's science and the scientists involved in it. Mann contended that the fossil fuel industry is an oligarchy. Some might dispute that American oil, gas, and coal magnates met the dictionary definition of a small, privileged group that effectively rules over the majority. But it was indisputable that they funded and helped orchestrate a series of vitriolic personal attacks that would threaten Mann's livelihood, derail climate legislation, and alter the course of the Obama presidency. If there was a single ultra-wealthy interest group that hoped to see Obama fail as he took office, it was the fossil fuel industry. And if there was one test of its members' concentrated financial power over the machinery of American democracy, it was this minority's ability to stave off government action on climate change as science and the rest of the world were moving in the opposite direction. While Obama's healthcare bill was useful in riling up Tea Party protesters, his environmental and energy policies were the real target of many of the multimillionaires and billionaires in the Cook Circle. For most of the world's population, the costs of inaction on climate change were far greater than those of action. But for the fossil fuel industry, as Mann put it, it's like the switch from whale oil in the 19th century. They're fighting to maintain the status quo, no matter how dumb. Coal, oil, and gas magnates formed the nucleus of the Cook donor network. Guest lists for the summits read like a who's who of America's most successful and most conservative fossil fuel barons, the majority of whom were private, independent operators of privately owned companies. They were men who had either made or inherited enormous fortunes in extractive energy without having to answer to public shareholders or much of anyone else. Among the group, for instance, was Corbin Corby Robertson Jr., the grandson of one of Texas's most legendary oil barons, Hugh Roy Cullen. Robertson, a former captain of the football team at the University of Texas, from which he graduated in 1969, had taken a bold, unorthodox risk with his inherited oil fortune. He had bet almost all of it on coal, reportedly accumulating by 2003 the single largest private cache of coal reserves in America. He owned, by one count, 21 billion tons of coal reserves, enough to fuel the entire country for 20 years. Only the U.S. government reportedly owned more coal than his private, Houston-based company, Quintana Resources Capital. Other donors in the network included Harold Hamm and Larry Nichols, two of the most successful pioneers in fracking, the environmentally controversial process by which water and chemicals are injected underground into rock formations to extract oil and natural gas. Hamm, the founder of Continental Resources, was a self-made billionaire wildcatter whom the National Journal likened to John D. Rockefeller. While his nearly billion-dollar divorce settlement and amazing rise from being born the youngest of 13 children in a family of sharecroppers made tabloid history, business journals were more focused on his company, which almost overnight had become the face of fracking in North Dakota's Bakken Shale. Joining him in the network, on the opposite end of the social scale, was Larry Nichols, head of Devon Energy and later chairman of the American Petroleum Institute, the foremost trade association for the oil industry. A graduate of Princeton and a former Supreme Court clerk, Nichols had urged his family's Oklahoma Energy Company to buy Mitchell Energy after he noticed that its natural gas output was climbing because of fracking. Nichols combined the process with his own company's expertise in horizontal drilling to unleash what became known as the unconventional gas revolution, as the energy industry historian Daniel Yergin wrote in The Quest. The Kochs, too, had investments in the chemicals, pipelines, and other aspects of fracking. The donor network also boasted spectacularly successful oilmen like Philip Anschutz, heir to a Western oil drilling fortune, who himself discovered a fabled oil field on the Wyoming-Utah border in the 1980s, after which he diversified into ranches, railroads, and communications. The network included many smaller operators too. There were oilmen from Wyoming, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado, and coal magnates from Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. The largest distributor of propane canisters in the country was also involved. Participating, too, were many of those whose businesses provided ancillary support to America's energy sector. In addition to the Kochs, there were numerous other owners of pipelines, drilling equipment, and oil service companies, including the legendary Bechtel family, which made billions building refineries and pipelines in Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and elsewhere. Most of the actual donors in this group preferred to keep low profiles, letting the politicians speak for them. They were expert in casting the group's reservations about government regulation in lofty philosophical terms. The politicians called them job creators and patriots, responsible for American energy independence. Clearly, though, there were few Americans for whom government caps on carbon posed a more direct financial threat. The problem for this group was that by 2008 the arithmetic of climate change presented an almost unimaginable challenge. If the world were to stay within the range of carbon emissions that scientists deemed reasonable in order for atmospheric temperatures to remain tolerable through the mid-century, 80% of the fossil fuel industry's reserves would have to stay unused in the ground. In other words, scientists estimated that the fossil fuel industry owned roughly 5 times more oil, gas, and coal than the planet could safely burn. If the government interfered with the free market in order to protect the planet, the potential losses for these companies were catastrophic. If, however, the carbon from these reserves were burned wantonly without the government applying any brakes, scientists predicted an intolerable rise in atmospheric temperatures, triggering potentially irreversible global damage to life on Earth. As early as 1997, one member of the Koch group sounded the alarm about the coming regulatory threat. That year Lew Ward, the retiring chairman of the Independent Petroleum Association of America, the trade group of independent oil and gas producers, delivered a Jeremiah as his swan song. Ward, who was himself an Oklahoma oil man, began by proudly ticking off the various tax loopholes he helped pass during his tenure. "We've been fortunate the past couple of years to have a Republican Congress," he noted. But he warned that the various policy skirmishes the industry had survived recently were nothing but a dress rehearsal for the real show, the possible carbon tax that could help pay the costs of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Ward perceived accurately that the climate change issue was coming and argued that if the radical environmentalist off-oil agenda succeeded, we can look down the road a little way and see an industry under siege. He vowed, "We are not going to let that happen. You can take that to the bank." Ward's swagger was well grounded. The oil industry had held parochial but powerful sway over American politics for years. As early as 1913, the oil industry used its clout to win a special tax loophole, the oil depletion allowance. On the theory that oil exploration was risky and costly, it enabled the industry to deduct so much income when it hit gushers that many oil companies evaded income taxes altogether. After the loophole was scandalously enlarged in 1926, liberals, stymied by the oil patch's defenders in Congress, tried unsuccessfully for 5 decades before they were finally able to close it. No American politician's rise to power in the last century was more fueled by oil than that of Lyndon Johnson. As Robert Caro recounts in The Path to Power, starting in 1940 Johnson rose from a neophyte congressman to the Democratic Party's consummate power broker by handing out campaign contributions from his enormously wealthy backers in the Texas oil fields and defending their interests. Although the oil industry benefited enormously from the federal government in the form of favorable tax treatment, huge government contracts, and aid in building pipelines, as well as other handouts, it became a bastion of anti-government conservatism. In fact, as its wealth grew, the Texas oil patch was the source not only of an astounding amount of campaign lucre but also of a particularly extreme strain of right-wing politics. In his book about the state's oil fortunes, The Big Rich, Brian Burrow speculates that what animated many of the magnates was the deep tissue insecurity of the nouveau riche who were hell-bent on keeping all they had just gained. If there was a progenitor of Texas's modern-day ultra-conservative oil faction, it was Corby Robertson's grandfather Hugh Roy Cullen, who helped make Quintana a billion-dollar enterprise. With roots in the fallen gentry of the Confederacy, he belonged to a band of oilmen that loathed Northern liberals, denigrated FDR's administration as the Jew deal, and formed a third party whose plank called for the restoration of the supremacy of the white race. Cullen's political ambitions expanded with his fortune, and in 1952, half a century before the Kochs became giant political spenders, he was the single biggest donor in American politics and a key supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade. But at the time, his brand of radically right-wing, oil-fueled politics was doomed to be marginalized. Burrow explains that to succeed in politics Cullen needed a support organization of some kind, but building one was something he was unwilling or incapable of doing. Half a century later, however, with the Cocktopus in place, Cullen's grandson and fellow oilmen would fare far better. Opposition to curbs on carbon had long been building in the industry. The concept that the Earth was warming, and mankind was causing it, first broke into the mainstream media in 1988 when the climate modeler James Hansen, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, testified before a Senate committee about it, amid a nationwide heat wave. The New York Times played his dramatic findings on its front page. During his presidency, George H.W. Bush, like most political leaders of both parties at the time, accepted the science without dispute. He vowed to protect the environment, promising to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect and sending his Secretary of State, James Baker, to the first international summit of climate scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Although Bush was a Republican, he was not an outlier in his party. For decades, the environmental movement had enjoyed bipartisan support. As public opinion mounted in favor of climate action, however, the fossil fuel industry organized and financed a stealthy state-of-the-art counteroffensive. Despite the agreement of both parties' presidential candidates in 2008 that something needed to be done to stave off climate change, powerful outside interests had been working overtime to erode that consensus. The conservative infrastructure necessary to wage a war of ideas was already in place. All it took to focus the attack on climate science was money. And beneath the surface, it was pouring in. Kurt Davies, the director of research at Greenpeace, the liberal environmental group, spent months trying to trace the funds flowing into a web of nonprofit organizations and talking heads, all denying the reality of global warming as if working from the same script. What he discovered was that from 2005 to 2008, a single source, the Kochs, poured almost $25 million into dozens of different organizations fighting climate reform. The sum was staggering. His research showed that Charles and David had outspent what was then the world's largest public oil company, ExxonMobil, by a factor of 3. In a 2010 report, Greenpeace crowned Koch Industries, a company few had ever heard of at the time, the kingpin of climate science denial. The first peer-reviewed academic study on the topic added further detail. Robert Brull, a Drexel University professor of sociology and environmental science, discovered that between 2003 and 2010 over $500 million was spent on what he described as a massive campaign to manipulate and mislead the public about the threat posed by climate change. The study examined the tax records of more than 100 nonprofit organizations engaged in challenging the prevailing science on global warming. What it found was, in essence, a corporate lobbying campaign disguised as a tax-exempt, philanthropic endeavor. Some 140 conservative foundations funded the campaign, Brull found. During the 7-year period he studied, these foundations distributed $558 million in the form of 5,299 grants to 91 different nonprofit organizations. The money went to think tanks, advocacy groups, trade associations, other foundations, and academic and legal programs. Cumulatively, this private network waged a permanent campaign to undermine Americans' faith in climate science and to defeat any effort to regulate carbon emissions. The cast of conservative organizations identified by Brull was familiar to anyone who had followed the funding of the modern conservative movement. Among those he pinpointed as the largest bankrollers of climate change denial were foundations affiliated with the Cook and Scaife families, both of whose fortunes derived partly from oil. Also heavily involved were the Bradley Foundation and several others associated with hugely wealthy families participating in the Cook donor summits, such as foundations run by the DeVos family, Art Pope, the retail magnate from North Carolina, and John Templeton Jr., a doctor and heir to the fortune of his father, John Templeton Sr., an American mutual fund pioneer who eventually renounced his U.S. citizenship in favor of living in the Bahamas, reportedly saving $100 million on taxes. Brull found that as the money was dispersed, 3/4 of the funds from these and other sources financing what he called the climate change counter-movement were untraceable. Powerful funders are supporting the campaign to deny scientific findings about global warming and raise public doubts about the roots and remedies of this massive global threat. At the very least, he argued, American voters deserve to know who is behind these efforts. Instead, by the time Obama took office, some of the biggest bankrollers of the war against climate science had, if anything, gone further underground. Rather than funding the campaign directly, a growing number of private conservative foundations and donors had begun directing their contributions through an organization called Donors Trust that in essence became a screen for the right wing, behind which fingerprints disappeared from the cache. Housed in a humdrum brick building in Alexandria, Virginia, Donors Trust and its affiliate, Donors Capital Fund, were memorably described by Mother Jones's Andy Kroll as the dark money ATM of the conservative movement. Founded in 1999 by Whitney Ball, an ardent libertarian from West Virginia who had overseen development of the Cook-founded Cato Institute, Donors Trust boasted one key advantage for wealthy conservatives. It made their contributions appear to be going to Ball's bland-sounding donor-advised fund, rather than to the far more controversial conservative groups she distributed it to afterward. The mechanism thus erased the donors' names from the money trail. Meanwhile, the donors retain the same if not bigger charitable tax deductions. As the Donors Trust website advertised, you wish to keep your charitable giving private, especially gifts funding sensitive or controversial issues. Set up a Donors Trust account and ask that your gifts remain anonymous. Know that any contributions to your Donors Trust account that have to be reported to the IRS will not become public information. Unlike with private foundations, gifts from your account will remain as anonymous as you request. Between 1999 and 2015, Donors Trust redistributed some $750 million from the pooled contributions to myriad conservative causes under its own name. Ordinarily, under the law, in exchange for their tax breaks, private foundations such as the Charles G. Cook Foundation were required to publicly disclose the charitable groups to whom they made their grants. It was one way to assure that these public service organizations were in fact serving the public. But donor-advised funds defeated this minimum transparency. Ball argued that the mechanism wasn't suspicious, or even unusual, and that liberals too had their own donor-advised fund, the Tides Foundation. Donors Trust, the conservative answer to the Tides Foundation, however, soon had 4 times the funds and a far more strategic board. Its directors consisted of top officials of several of the most important institutions in the conservative movement, including the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, and the Institute for Justice, the Libertarian Legal Center whose start-up funds had been supplied by Charles Koch. They functioned as a central committee, coordinating grant-making. What Brull noticed as he studied the money behind climate change denial was that as criticism of those blocking reform increased around 2007, tens of millions of dollars of contributions from fossil fuel interests like Koch and ExxonMobil seemed to have disappeared from the public fight. Meanwhile, a growing and commensurate amount of anonymous money from donors' trusts started funding the climate change countermovement. In 2003, for instance, Brull found that donors' trust money was the source of only 3% of the 140 groups whose financial records he studied. By 2010, it had grown to 24%. The circumstantial evidence suggested that the fossil fuel interests bankrolling climate change denial were deliberately hiding their hands, but Brull couldn't prove it. "We just have this great big unknown out there about where all the money is coming from," he said. Relations between the Kochs and Donors Trust were close. Disclosures showed that the Kochs foundations made sizable gifts to Donors Trust, which in turn dispersed large amounts of cash to their favorite nonprofit groups. In 2010, for instance, the single largest grant that it made to any organization was a $7.4 million gift to the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, whose chairman was David Koch. These funds accounted for about 40% of the AFP Foundation's funding that year, belying the notion that it was a genuine grassroots organization. AFP, meanwhile, not only took a lead role in organizing the Tea Party rebellion but also spearheaded a national drive to block action on climate change, aiming in every way possible to merge the two movements. What much of the stealth funding bought was the dissemination of scientific doubt. The fossil fuel industry thus followed the same deceptive playbook that had been developed by the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton on behalf of the tobacco companies in the 1960s, in order to fabricate uncertainty about the science linking smoking to cancer. As the firm's memo had notoriously put it, "Doubt is our product." To add credibility to their side, the tobacco companies funded a network of official-sounding institutes and smokers' rights groups. This strategy soon characterized the global warming denial movement, too. There was in fact some uncertainty about global warming, as there is about virtually every scientific hypothesis. Probability, rather than absolute certainty, is the nature of the scientific method. But as Dr. James Baker, former head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, said in 2005, "There's a better scientific consensus on this than on any issue I know except maybe Newton's second law of thermodynamics." Nonetheless, in 1998, the American Petroleum Institute, along with several top oil industry executives and conservative think tank officials, colluded on a secret plan to spend $2 million to confuse the press and the public about this growing scientific consensus. The plan called for recruiting skeptical scientists and training them in public relations so that they could act as spokesmen, thereby adding legitimacy and cover to the industry's agenda. According to the Republican War on Science, the plan was the brainchild of William O'Keefe, a former chief operating officer at the American Petroleum Institute and a lobbyist for ExxonMobil who became president of the George C. Marshall Institute, a conservative think tank in Virginia. O'Keefe continued to lobby for ExxonMobil while heading the research center. Described by Newsweek as a central cog in the denial machine, the think tank specialized in providing contrarian scientific defenses for dubious clients. Funded by the Scaife, Olin, and Bradley Foundations, among others, it had begun as a center for Cold War hawks vouching for President Reagan's Star Wars missile shield, but expanded into debunking other scientific findings that could be construed as liberal or anti-corporate. Money from threatened corporate interests, meanwhile, frequently funded the research. Leading the charge against climate science were two elderly, retired physicists affiliated with the George C. Marshall Institute who had previously defended the tobacco industry, Fred Seitz and Fred Singer. As Naomi Orskes and Eric Conway write in Merchants of Doubt, the two Freds had been eminent physicists in their day, but neither had any expertise in either the environment or health, yet, for years the press quoted these men as experts. What they were in fact expert in was converting a torrent of unseen funding into fighting facts, and merchandising doubt, according to Orskes and Conway. But for the fossil fuel industry, winning over public opinion was no easy feat. As the new millennium dawned, the general public was broadly in favor of environmental regulations. As late as 2003, over 75% of Republicans supported strict environmental regulations, according to polls. For help on their public relations campaign, in 2002 the opponents of carbon regulations hired Frank Luntz, who warned that the environment is probably the issue on which Republicans in general and President Bush in particular is most vulnerable. To win, he argued, global warming deniers had to portray themselves as preserving and protecting the environment. In his confidential memo Winning the Global Warming Debate, which eventually leaked to the public, Luntz stressed as his number one point that opponents of carbon regulations absolutely must not raise economic arguments first. In other words, telling the truth about their financial interests was a recipe for losing. The key, he went on, was to question the science. You need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate, he advised. So long as voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community, he said, regulations could be forestalled. Language that worked, he advised, included phrases like "we must not rush to judgment" and "we should not commit America to any international document that handcuffs us." Later, Luntz would switch sides and publicly admit that global warming was a real peril. But in the view of Michael Mann, whose scientific work soon became the target of climate change deniers, Luntz's 2002 memo served as a virtual hunting license. It basically said you have to discredit the scientists and create fake groups. It doesn't say engage in character assassination, but it was leaning in that direction. On cue, organizations funded and directed by the Kochs tore into global warming science and the experts behind it. The Cato Institute, the libertarian think tank that Charles Cook founded, put out a steady stream of reports like Apocalypse Not, Science, Economics, and Environmentalism and Climate of Fear, Why We Shouldn't Worry About Global Warming. A grant from the Charles G. Cook Charitable Foundation, along with funds from ExxonMobil and the American Petroleum Institute, also helped pay for a non-peer-reviewed study claiming that polar bears, who were mascots of the global warming debate, were not endangered by climate change. It quickly drew criticism from experts in the field like the National Wildlife Federation, which predicted that by 2050 two-thirds of the polar bear population would disappear because their habitat was melting. Nonetheless, the conclusions of the oil-financed study were echoed throughout the network of Cook-funded groups. There are more polar bears today than there have ever been, Ed Crane, the head of Cato, insisted. He argued that global warming theories just give the government more control of the economy. It was the authors of the revisionist polar bear study who also took one of the first shots at Michael Mann's iconic hockey stick study, publishing a takedown in 2003. The credentials of the critics, Sally Baliunas and Wayhawk Willie Soon, looked impressive. Soon was identified as a scientist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. But it later emerged that he had a doctoral degree in aerospace engineering, not climate science, and had only a part-time, unpaid affiliation with the Smithsonian Institution. Without disclosing it, he had accepted more than $1.2 million from the fossil fuel industry from 2005 to 2015, including at least $230,000 from the Charles G. Cook Charitable Foundation. It was later revealed that some of the payments for his papers were marked as deliverables by the fossil fuel companies. Soon's attack on Mann was so controversial that the editor and several other staffers sympathetic to Mann resigned in protest against Climate Research, the small journal that published it. Yet from that moment on, Mann, who was at the time an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Virginia, had a target on his back. As the scientific consensus grew in support of global warming, the industry's efforts to fight it became increasingly aggressive. The presidential candidacy of the environmental activist Al Gore in 2000 posed an obvious threat to the fossil fuel industry. That election cycle, Koch Industries and its employees dispersed over $800,000 in support of his opponent George W. Bush and other Republicans. Koch Industries' Political Action Committee was spending more on federal campaigns than any other oil and gas company, including ExxonMobil. The company's expenditures on Washington lobbying expanded more than 20-fold from 2004 to 2008, reaching $20 million. The Koch's corporate self-interest had by then thoroughly trumped their youthful disdain for engaging in conventional politics. Political contributions from oil, gas, and coal companies became increasingly polarized during this period. In 1990, the oil and gas industry's political giving was skewed 60% in favor of Republicans and 40% in favor of Democrats. By the middle of the Bush years, 80% of the industry's giving went to Republicans. Giving from coal mining firms was even more lopsided, with 90% going to Republicans, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. The investment soon paid off. As the Harvard political scientist Theda Skocpol writes in a study of climate change denial, the Republican Party, particularly in the U.S. Congress, soon swung sharply to the right on climate issues. Partisan differences remained small among the general public but grew into a gaping chasm among elected officials. Conservative opponents of carbon regulations, like James Inhofe, a Republican senator from Oklahoma who received serial campaign donations from Koch Industries POC, turned the rhetoric up to a boiling point. Global warming, he proclaimed, was the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Inhofe's spokesman, Mark Morano, had a reputation as a professional pit bull, as Mann later put it, derived from his earlier role promoting the claims of the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth, a group that had smeared John Kerry's military record during his 2004 presidential campaign. At the time, Morano was working for a conservative news outlet that was funded in part by the Scaife, Bradley, and Olin foundations. By 2006, Morano had moved on to Swift boating scientists. "You've got to name names and you've got to go after individuals," he explained in an interview with the documentary filmmaker Robert Kenner. He seemed to relish making political disagreements personal, taunting and inflaming opponents with a grin in televised showdowns. Morano denounced James Hansen as a wannabe Unabomber and Mann as a charlatan. He said of the scapegoating, "We had a lot of fun with it." Morano charged that Mann was part of what he called the climate con, which he described as a lavishly funded climate machine that is lobbying for laws and uses every bit of data or new study to proclaim it's worse than we thought or we must act now. Morano's background was in political science, which he studied at George Mason University, not climate science. "I'm not a scientist but I play one on TV," he joked. Nonetheless, he asserted authoritatively that man-made global warming fears are a grand political narrative, not science. The George W. Bush years, meanwhile, proved a bonanza for the fossil fuel industry, which had thrown its weight behind his election. The coal industry in particular had played a major role in delivering West Virginia's 5 electoral votes to Bush in 2000, sealing a victory that would have gone to Al Gore had he carried the formerly Democratic state instead. State political veterans and top White House staffers concur that it was basically a coal-fired victory, the Wall Street Journal wrote. The industry was lavishly rewarded. Vice President Dick Cheney, a former CEO of the oilfield equipment and services company Halliburton, personally took charge of energy policy. Bush had vowed during the campaign to act on climate change by limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but once in office Cheney countermanded him. In what Cheney's biographer Barton Gellman describes as a case study in managing an errant boss, Cheney shifted the administration's position to arguing that the science on global warming was inconclusive, requiring more scientific inquiry. The 2005 Energy Bill, which Hillary Clinton dubbed at the time the Dick Cheney lobbyist energy bill, offered enormous subsidies and tax breaks for fossil fuel-intensive companies. The Bush administration weakened regulations, for instance, on coal-fired power plants. Taking a position that was eventually overturned by the courts, it exempted mercury emissions from regulation under the Clean Air Act, reversing the position taken by the Clinton administration. Fracking got a boost too. Cheney used his influence to exempt it from regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act, over objections from the Environmental Protection Agency. The fracking industry boomed. Within 5 years, Devon Energy, Larry Nichols's company, would rank as the 4th largest producer of natural gas in the United States. Harold Hamm would become a multi-billionaire. Cheney's former company Halliburton also became a major player in the fracking industry, illustrating that free market advocates greatly benefited from government favors. In all, the Bush Energy Act contained some $6 billion in oil and gas subsidies and $9 billion in coal subsidies. The Kochs routinely cast themselves as libertarians who deplored government taxes, regulations, and subsidies, but records show they took full advantage of the special tax credits and subsidies available to the oil, ethanol, and pipeline business, among other areas of commerce in which they were engaged. In many cases, their lobbyists fought hard to protect these perks. In addition, their companies benefited from nearly $100 million in government contracts in the decade after 2000, according to a study by Media Matters, a liberal watchdog group. When Barack Obama took office, the fossil fuel industry was not only eager to preserve its perks but also more militant in its opposition to climate change science than ever. Skocpol notes that 2007 had been a turning point in the fight. That year, Al Gore was awarded both a Nobel Peace Prize and featured in an Academy Award-winning documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth. The film featured Mann's hockey stick graph. Gore's acclaim and Mann's simple chart helped raise concern about global warming to a new peak, with 41% of the American public saying it worried them a great deal. At this critical juncture, when Americans in general might have been persuaded of the urgency of dealing with global warming, Skocpol notes, opponents fought back with new vigor. The whole ideological assembly line that Richard Fink and Charles Cook had envisioned decades earlier, including the entire conservative media sphere, was enlisted in the fight. Fox television and conservative talk radio hosts gave saturation coverage to the issue, portraying climate scientists as swindlers pushing a radical, partisan, and anti-American agenda. Allied think tanks pumped out books and position papers, whose authors testified in Congress and appeared on a whirlwind tour of talk shows. Climate denial got disseminated deliberately and rapidly from think tank tomes to the daily media fare of about 30 to 40% of the U.S. populace, Skocpol estimates. Climate contrarians also recruited conservative evangelical Christian leaders, who distrusted government in general and had impressive political and communications clout. One byproduct of this pact was an organization in the Washington suburbs called the Cornwall Alliance, which released a hit film in evangelical circles called Resisting the Green Dragon that equated environmentalism with worship of a false god. It described global warming as one of the greatest deceptions of our day. Climate change became such a hot-button issue for Christian fundamentalists that Richard Cizik, a vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals, who was considered among the most powerful leaders in the movement, was forced to resign in late 2008 after publicly endorsing climate change science. Before long, public opinion polls showed that concern about climate change among all but hardcore liberals had collapsed. As the 2008 presidential campaign played out, the issue grew increasingly polarized. Just before the election, with the economy in tumult, John McCain, the Republican presidential candidate, reiterated that the climate problem was real. He also said that green jobs would lead the way to economic recovery. But his choice of Sarah Palin as his running mate, one of whose mantras was "Drill, baby, drill," indicated just how influential the voice of climate extremism was becoming within the Republican Party. As Obama took office, America derived over 85% of its total energy from oil, gas, and coal. The business was enormous, with profits and influence to match. Conventional wisdom nonetheless held that Obama's election portended well for environmentalists. Mann, too, was optimistic, but he worried about what he regarded as a troubling complacency among his colleagues. He knew that the Obama administration posed two huge threats to the fossil fuel industry, and he doubted the industry would just roll over. The first threat was Obama's Environmental Protection Agency. Lisa Jackson, the EPA administrator, announced that she intended to treat greenhouse gas emissions as hazardous pollutants, regulating them for the first time under the Clean Air Act. It was an authority that the Supreme Court had upheld in 2007. But no previous administration had tried to take on the industry so frontally. The second was the Democrats' plan to introduce the long-incubating cap-and-trade bill to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Even before Obama was inaugurated, Americans for Prosperity had begun taking aim at the cap-and-trade idea, circulating a pledge requiring elected officials to oppose new spending to fight climate change. Koch Industries, meanwhile, began lobbying against government mandates to reduce carbon emissions. Then, soon after Obama was inaugurated, an odd television ad popped up around the country that seemed strangely off-message. While most Americans were transfixed by the unfolding economic disaster that was preoccupying the Obama administration in its first few months, out of nowhere, it seemed, was a discordant television spot about a spoiled slacker named Carlton. "Hey there," said a lush-looking young man, plucking away at a plate of canapés. "I'm Carlton, the wealthy eco-hypocrite. I inherited my money and attended fancy schools. I own 3 homes and 5 cars, but always talk with my rich friends about saving the planet. And I want Congress to spend billions on programs in the name of global warming and green energy, even if it causes massive unemployment, higher energy bills, and digs people like you even deeper into the recession. Who knows? Maybe I'll even make money off of it." Carlton was, in fact, the creation of Americans for Prosperity, the nonprofit social welfare group founded and heavily funded by David Koch, who of course had inherited hundreds of millions of dollars, attended Deerfield Academy, owned 4 homes, a ski lodge in Aspen, a Belle Epoque mansion, Villa El Sarmiento, in Palm Beach, a sprawling beach house in the Hamptons, and an 18-room duplex at 740 Park Avenue in Manhattan, and drove, among other cars, a Land Rover and a Ferrari. By creating Carlton as a decoy, the Kochs and their allies evidently hoped to convince the public that government action on climate change posed a threat to people like you or ordinary Americans' pocketbooks. But it of course posed a far greater threat to their own. With ownership of refineries, pipelines, a coal subsidiary, the Sea Rice Coal Company, coal-fired power plants, fertilizer, petroleum coke manufacturing, timber, and leases on over 1 million acres of untapped Canadian oil sands, Koch Industries alone routinely released some 24 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere a year. Any financial penalty that the government placed on carbon pollution would threaten both their immediate profit margins and the long-term value of the enormous investments they had in still untapped fossil fuel reserves. The Kochs themselves said little about their views on climate change at the time. But in one interview, David Koch suggested that if real, it would prove a boon. The Earth will be able to support enormously more people because a far greater land area will be available to produce food, he argued. Charles's thinking was reflected in the company's in-house newsletter, which featured an article titled "Blowing Smoke." "Why are such unproven or false claims promoted?" it asked. Rather than fighting global warming, the newsletter suggested, mankind would be better off adapting to it. "Since we can't control Mother Nature, let's figure out how to get along with her changes," it advised. A similar line was subtly argued in the David H. Koch Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, which opened in March 2010. The message of the exhibition, funded by his fortune, was that the human race had evolved for the better in response to previous environmental challenges and would adapt in the face of climate change. 2. An interactive game suggested that if the climate on Earth became intolerable, people might build underground cities and develop short, compact bodies or curved spines so that moving around in tight spaces will be no problem. Soon the climate issue was creeping into Tea Party rallies, too. As protesters erupted in generalized rage in the spring and summer of 2009, Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works, and the other secretly funded Tea Party groups succeeded to a remarkable extent in channeling the populist anger into the climate fight. At the first big tax day Tea Party rallies on April 15, 2009, while most protesters were flaying Obama's bank bailouts and stimulus plan, the staff of Americans for Prosperity handed out free T-shirts and signs protesting what would ordinarily seem to be an arcane issue for most people in the streets, the cap-and-trade bill. The Obama budget proposes the largest excise tax in history, the advocacy group's talking points stressed. To dramatize the issue, offshoots of Americans for Prosperity sent carbon cops, who pranced into Tea Party rallies pretending to be overreaching emissaries from the EPA, warning that backyard barbecues, churches, and lawn mowers were about to be shut down because of new, stricter interpretations of the Clean Air Act. The advocacy group also launched what it called the Cost of Hot Air Tour to mock the cap-and-trade proposal. It featured a 70-foot-tall bright red hot air balloon on whose side was emblazoned a slogan reducing the argument against the cap-and-trade proposal to 6 scary words. Cap and trade, it said, means higher taxes, lost jobs, less freedom. Americans for Prosperity sent the balloon to so many states in 2009 that the group's president, Tim Phillips, later admitted, "I rode more hot air balloons in that year-and-a-half period than I ever want to ride again. I do not like hot air balloons." The public campaign was accompanied by a darker covered one. Tom Perriello, a freshman Democratic congressman from Charlottesville, Virginia, who favored the cap-and-trade bill, discovered this in the summer of 2009 when constituents started bombarding his office with angry missives. Reams of faxes arrived from voters, many representing local chapters of ordinarily supportive liberal groups like the NAACP and the American Association of University Women. Under official letterheads, they argued passionately that the cap-and-trade legislation would raise electric bills, hurting the poor. But an effort by the congressman's staff to reach the angry constituents revealed that the letters were forgeries, sent on behalf of a coal industry trade group by Bonner and Associates, a Washington-based public relations firm. After the fraud was exposed, the firm fired an employee. But it wasn't an isolated incident. Perriello, like many other elected officials that summer, also found himself heckled during town hall meetings. One such heckler called him a traitor for supporting the cap-and-trade bill, while another videotaped the showdown. Later one of the disruptive members of the audience admitted to the investigative reporter Li Fang that he had been put up to it by the Virginia director of Americans for Prosperity. Similar outbursts took place all over the country that summer. Mike Castle, a moderate Republican congressman from Delaware, was accosted by voters demanding to know how he could even consider voting for such a hoax, according to Eric Pooley's account in The Climate War. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Petroleum Institute, and other industry representatives, it turned out, had created a grassroots group called Energy Citizens that joined Tea Party organizations in packing the town halls with protesters. Fanning the flames were the right-wing radio hosts. "It's not about saving the planet," Rush Limbaugh told his audience. "It's not about anything, folks, other than raising taxes and redistributing wealth." Glenn Beck warned listeners it would lead to water rationing. "This is about controlling every part of your life, even taking a shower." Torquing up the fear, Republicans in Congress quoted from a study by the Heritage Foundation that predicted it would add thousands of dollars to Americans' energy bills and lead to devastating unemployment. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office put out an authoritative study contradicting this, demonstrating that the average cost to Americans would be the same as buying a postage stamp a day. But John Boehner, the Republican minority leader in the House, dismissed the real numbers, suggesting anyone who believed them could go ask the unicorns. Despite the inflammatory atmosphere, the House passed a bill to cap and trade carbon dioxide emissions on June 26, 2009. The process wasn't pretty. It took an extraordinary push from its sponsors, Congressman Henry Waxman of California and Ed Markey of Massachusetts, and an epic amount of horse trading between environmentalists and the affected industries. Many environmentalists thought the final product was so flawed that it wasn't worth the trouble. But for those looking for Congress to reach the kind of moderate compromises Obama had been elected to deliver, it was a first step. Rather than causing elation, though, the victory was clouded by trepidation. Supporters, particularly Democrats from conservative, fossil fuel-heavy states like Perriello and Rick Boucher of Virginia, feared there would be a steep price to pay. As the threat to the industry grew, so would its determination to stop them. That fall, television ads began appearing in states like Montana, where the Democratic Senator Max Baucus was already under attack from members of the Cook Network on the health care issue. There is no scientific evidence that CO2 is a pollutant. In fact, higher CO2 levels than we have today would help the Earth's ecosystems, the ads said, urging viewers to tell Baucus not to vote for the cap and trade bill, which would cost us jobs. The sponsor for the ad was a group curiously called CO2 is Green. Quietly funding it, according to Stephen Muffson, the energy reporter for the Washington Post, was Corbin Robertson, owner of the country's largest private cache of coal. Robertson's fingerprints were detectable behind another anti-climate change front group, too, the Coalition for Responsible Regulation. As soon as Obama's EPA took steps to regulate greenhouse gases, the previously unknown group took legal action to stop it. The group's private emails surfaced later, revealing how it successfully egged on Texas's bureaucrats to join the lawsuit, despite the state's own climatologists' belief that man-made global warming posed a real danger and that the EPA's scientific findings were solid. Neither Robertson's name nor that of his company appeared in the papers incorporating the organization. But its address and its top officers were the same as those of Robertson's company, Quintana. Following hard on the summer's raucous Tea Party protests, things got uglier in Washington as well. As Obama addressed a joint session of Congress laying out his health care proposal in September 2009, his speech was interrupted by Joe Wilson, a Republican congressman from South Carolina, shouting, "You lie," from the well of the House. Congress rebuked Wilson for his extraordinary breach of decorum, but within a month, climate skeptics were echoing Wilson's belligerence. One posted a report titled UN Climate Reports, They Lie. The opposition grew as the Obama administration got ready to head to Copenhagen in December 2009 for its first international climate summit. World leaders expected the United States would finally commit to serious reform. Previously, the United States had declined to join other developed nations in agreeing to limit greenhouse gas emissions under the Kyoto Protocol. Given Obama's position, time seemed to be running out for the fossil fuel forces and their free market allies. Then, on November 17, 2009, an anonymous commenter on a contrarian website declared, "A miracle has happened." With lethal timing, an unidentified saboteur had hacked expertly into the University of East Anglia's website and uploaded thousands of internal emails detailing the private communications of the scientists working in its famed climatic research unit. The climatologists at the British University had been in constant communication with those in America, and now all of their unguarded professional doubts, along with their unguarded and sometimes contemptuous asides about their opponents, stretching all the way back to 1996, were visible for the entire world to read. Chris Horner, a conservative climate contrarian working at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, another pro-corporate think tank subsidized by oil and other fossil fuel fortunes, including the Kochs, declared, "The blue dress moment may have arrived." But instead of using Monica Lewinsky's telltale garment to impeach Bill Clinton, they would use the words of the world's leading climate scientists to impeach the climate change movement. If edited down and taken out of context, their exchanges could be made to appear to suggest a willingness to falsify data in order to buttress the idea that global warming was real. Dubbing the alleged scandal ClimateGate, they went into overdrive. The web of organizations, funded in part by the Kochs, pounced on the hacked emails. Cato scholars were particularly energetic in promoting the story. In the 2 weeks after the emails went public, one Cato scholar alone gave more than 20 media interviews trumpeting the alleged scandal. The story soon spread from obviously slanted venues to the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, adding mainstream credence. Tim Phillips, the president of Americans for Prosperity, jumped on the hacked emails, describing them to a gathering of conservative bloggers at the Heritage Foundation as a crucial tipping point and adding, "If we win the science argument, I think it's game, set, and match for them." Eventually, 7 independent inquiries exonerated the climate scientists, finding nothing in the emails to discredit their work or the larger consensus on global warming. In the meantime, though, Michael Mann's life, along with the environmental movement, was plunged into turmoil. Mann was among the scientists most roiled by the mysterious hacking incident. 4 words in the purloined emails were seized upon as evidence that he was a fraud. In describing his research, his colleagues had praised his use of a trick that had helped him hide the decline. Mann's detractors leaped to the conclusion that these words proved that his research was just a trick to fool the public and that he had deliberately hidden an actual decline in 20th century temperatures in order to fake evidence of global warming. The facts, when fully understood, were very different. It was a British colleague, not Mann, who had written the ostensibly damning words, and when examined in context, they were utterly mundane. The trick referred to was just a clever technique Mann had devised in order to provide a backup data set. The decline in question was a reference to a decline in available information from certain kinds of tree rings after 1961, which had made it hard to have a consistent set of data. Another scientist, not Mann, had found an alternative source of data to compensate for this problem, which was what was meant by hide the decline. The only genuinely negative disclosure from the emails was that Mann and the other climatologists had agreed among themselves to withhold, rather than share, their research with some of their critics, whom they disparaged. Given the harassment they had been subjected to, their reasoning was understandable, but it violated the customary transparency expected within the scientific community. Other than that, the ClimateGate scandal was, in other words, not one. It took no time, nevertheless, for the hacked emails to spur a witch hunt. Within days, Inhofe and other Republicans in Congress who were recipients of Cook campaign donations demanded an investigation into Mann. They sent threatening letters to Penn State, where he was by then a tenured professor. Later, Virginia's Attorney General, Ken Cuccinelli, a graduate of the George Mason School of Law, would also subpoena Mann's former employer, the University of Virginia, demanding all records relating to his decade-old academic research, regardless of libertarians' professed concerns about government intrusion. Eventually, Virginia's Supreme Court dismissed its own Attorney General's case with prejudice, finding he had misread the law. By New Year's Eve 2009, Mann was feeling under attack from all sides. Conservative talk radio hosts lambasted him regularly. Contrarian websites were lit up with blog posts detailing his iniquity. A self-described former CIA officer contacted colleagues in Mann's department offering a $10,000 reward to any who would provide dirt on him, confidentiality assured. Soon after, Mann asserts, a think tank called the National Center for Public Policy Research led a campaign to get Mann's National Science Foundation grants revoked. As Mann recounts in his book The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, 2 conservative nonprofit law firms, the Southeastern Legal Foundation and the Landmark Legal Foundation, brought legal actions aimed at him. The think tank and the 2 law firms were funded by combinations of the same small constellation of family fortunes through their private charitable foundations. Omnipresent were Bradley, Olin, and Scaife. Charles Cox Foundation also was engaged in piling on. It helped subsidize the Landmark Legal Foundation. The Kochs evidently admired Landmark's president, Mark Levin, a longtime associate of the former Attorney General Edwin Meese III. In 2010, Americans for Prosperity hired Levin to promote it on his nationally syndicated talk radio show, thereby copying the deal that Freedom Works had struck with Glenn Beck. Levin was a curious choice of spokesman for the button-down, erudite Koch brothers. His style was incendiary, even rude. He later called Kenneth Vogel, the Politico reporter who broke the news of the deal with Americans for Prosperity, a vicious S.O.B, and told a female caller, "I don't know why your husband doesn't put a gun to his temple. Get the hell out of here." His attacks on Obama's policies were similarly heated, particularly regarding climate change. He said man and the other advocates of man-made global warming did not know how to conduct a correct statistical analysis and accused envirostatists of inventing global warming in order to justify a tyrannical government takeover. Their pursuit, he claimed, after all, is power, not truth. An especially grave attack on man's livelihood was launched, meanwhile, by yet another group, the Commonwealth Foundation for Public Policy Alternatives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The self-described think tank belonged to a national web of similar conservative organizations known as the State Policy Network. Much of Commonwealth's financial support came through Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund, making it impossible to identify the individual backers. But because it was based in Scaife's home state, Commonwealth had particularly deep ties to his family foundations. Michael Gleba, the chair of Commonwealth's board of directors, was also the president of the Sarah Scaife Foundation and treasurer of Scaife's Carthage Foundation and a trustee of both. This arrangement gave Commonwealth unusual clout, particularly over Pennsylvania's state legislature. The Pennsylvania think tank waged a campaign to get Mann fired and successfully lobbied Republican allies in the legislature to threaten to withhold Penn State's funding until the university took appropriate action against Mann. With the public university's finances held hostage, it agreed to investigate Mann. Meanwhile, the think tank ran a campaign of attack ads against him in the university's daily newspaper, as well as helping to organize an anti-Mann campus protest. It was nerve-wracking to be under that pressure at Penn State, recalls Mann. There were these nebulous accusations based on stolen emails. Ordinarily, it would have been clear there were no grounds for investigation. But it was promoted by the Commonwealth Foundation, which seems to almost have a stranglehold on Republicans in the state legislature. I knew I had done nothing wrong, but there was this uncertain future hanging over me. There was so much political pressure being brought to bear on Penn State I wasn't sure if they'd cave. In the meantime, death threats began appearing in Mann's inbox. I tried to shield my family as much as I could, he says. But this became impossible when one day he opened a suspicious-looking letter without thinking, only to have it release a cloud of white powder into his office. Fearing anthrax, he called the campus police. Soon the FBI quarantined his office behind crime tape, disrupting the whole department. The powder turned out to be harmless, but, Mann recalls, it was a spectacle. There was a point where I had the hotline number for the chief of police on our fridge, in case my wife saw anything unusual. It felt like there was a very calibrated campaign of vilification to the extent where the crazies might go after us. It was particularly disturbing to Mann that there appeared to be overlap between hardcore climate change deniers and Second Amendment enthusiasts, whipped up, he came to believe, by cynical special interests. Mann says, the disaffected, the people who have trouble putting dinner on the table, were being misled into believing that action on climate change meant that they want to take away your freedom and probably your guns, too. There was a very skillful campaign to indoctrinate them, he said. We've seen Second Amendment enthusiasts take action against abortion doctors. There's an attempt to paint us as villains in the same way. He was not alone in receiving death threats. Several climatologists, he said, including Phil Jones, director of the Hacked Climatic Research Unit in Great Britain, felt compelled to hire personal bodyguards. Luckily, Mann relates, both the Penn State investigations which the legislature required to be done a second time in greater depth and another one by the Inspector General of the National Science Foundation, essentially the highest scientific body in the United States, exonerated Mann. It lasted 2 years. It came out well. But 2 years is a long time, he says. I never imagined I'd be at the center of some contentious debate. It's not why you study what I did. What worries me, he adds, is that this circus-like atmosphere may have scared off many young scientists. It actually has a chilling effect. It prevents scientists from participating in the public discourse, because they fear they, or their department head, will be threatened. By the time Mann's scientific research was upheld, underscoring his integrity as well as the genuine danger posed by climate change, it hardly mattered. By then, the percentage of Americans who believed the world was warming had dropped a precipitous 14 points from 2008. Almost half of those polled by Gallup in 2010, 48% believed that fears of global warming were generally exaggerated, the highest numbers since the polling firm first posed the question more than a decade before. Watching from afar, Mann could see no cause for the United States to move in the opposite direction from science other than money. In the scientific community, the degree of confidence in climate change is rising, he said. In the public, it's either steady or falling. There's a divergence. That wedge is what the industry has bought. Although the cap and trade bill moved to the Senate, it was already dead. At first, Lindsey Graham, the independent-minded Republican from South Carolina, took a courageous leadership role in the fight, offering to co-sponsor the legislation with the Democrat John Kerry and the independent Joe Lieberman after declaring, to the surprise and delight of environmentalists, I have come to conclude that greenhouse gases and carbon pollution are not a good thing. Graham, however, feared pressure from his right flank. He warned the Democrats that they had to move fast, before Fox News caught wind of the process. As he feared, in April 2010, Fox News attacked him for backing a gas tax. A vitriolic Tea Party activist immediately held a press conference in his home state denouncing him as gay, and a political front group called American Solutions launched a negative campaign against him for his climate stance in South Carolina. American Solutions, it later turned out, was funded by huge fossil fuel and other corporate interests, many of whom were in the Cook fold. Among them were Larry Nichols of Devon Energy, Dick Farmer of Cintas, Stan Hubbard of Hubbard Broadcasting, and Sheldon Adelson, chairman of the Las Vegas Sands Corporation. Within days of the drubbing, Graham withdrew from the process. Harry Reid, the Democratic Majority Leader from Nevada, dealt the final blow to the cap and trade bill. Facing a tough re-election himself and worried about making Democrats walk the plank for the bill, he refused after Graham backed out to bring the legislation to the Senate floor for a vote. Opponents of climate change reform got their wish. Gridlock is the greatest friend a global warming skeptic has, because that's all you really want, Morano later acknowledged. There's no legislation we're championing. We're the negative force. We are just trying to stop stuff. Asked why the climate legislation failed, Al Gore told the New Yorker's Ryan Lizza, the influence of special interests is now at an extremely unhealthy level. It's at a point, he said, where it's virtually impossible for participants in the current political system to enact any significant change without first seeking and gaining permission from the largest commercial interests who are most affected by the proposed change. As the first legislation aimed at addressing climate change sputtered out, the Massey mine in West Virginia collapsed in a methane explosion, killing 29 miners. Soon after, a leak from the Deepwater Horizon oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico triggered the largest accidental oil spill in history, killing and causing birth defects in record numbers of marine animals. A grand jury would charge the owner of the Upper Big Branch mine with criminally conspiring to evade safety regulations, while a federal judge would find the oil rig's principal owner, British Petroleum, guilty of gross negligence and reckless conduct. Meanwhile, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was already above the level that scientists said risked causing runaway global warming. Obama acknowledged at this point that he knew the votes may not be there right now, but, he vowed, I intend to find them in the coming months. The conservative money machine, however, was already far ahead of him on an audacious new plan to try to ensure that he would never succeed. Chapter 9. Money is Speech, The Long Road to Citizens United. On May 17, 2010, a black-tie audience at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City applauded as a tall, jovial-looking billionaire loped to the stage. It was the 70th annual Spring Gala of American Ballet Theatre, and David Cook was being honored for his generosity as a member of the Board of Trustees. A longtime admirer of classical ballet, he had recently donated $2.5 million toward the company's upcoming season and had given many millions before that. As Cook received a token award, he was flanked by two of the gala's co-chairs, the socialite Blaine Trump, in a peach-colored gown, and the political scion Caroline Kennedy Schlossberg, in emerald green. Kennedy's mother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, had been a patron of the ballet and, coincidentally, the previous owner of a Fifth Avenue apartment that Cook had bought in 1995 and then sold 11 years later for $32 million, having found it too small. The gala marked the official arrival of Cook as one of New York's most prominent philanthropists. At the age of 70, he was recognized for an impressive history of giving. In 2008, he donated $100 million to modernize Lincoln Center's New York State Theater building, which now bore his name. He had given $20 million to the American Museum of Natural History, whose dinosaur wing was named for him. That spring, after noticing the decrepit state of the fountains outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he pledged at least $10 million for their renovation. He was a trustee of the museum, perhaps the most coveted social prize in the city, and served on the board of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where, after he donated more than $40 million, an endowed chair and a research center were named for him. One dignitary was conspicuously absent from the gala, the event's third honorary co-chair, Michelle Obama. Her office said that a scheduling conflict had prevented her from attending. In New York philanthropic circles, though, David Cook was a celebrity in his own right. With the help of a bevy of public relations advisors, he had sculpted an impressive public image. One associate said Cook had confided that he gave away approximately 40% of his income each year, which he estimated at about $1 billion. This of course left him with an annual income of some $600 million and considerably helped ease his tax burden, but he enjoyed the role, a family member said, in part because it bought him respectability. There was another side to his spending, however, that was then still largely secret. While David was happy to put his name on some of the country's most esteemed and beloved cultural and scientific institutions and to take a public bow at the ballet, his family's prodigious political spending was a much more private affair. It would in fact take years before the faint outlines of the Koch's massive political machinations began to surface through required public tax filings, and the full story may never be known. But a decision by the Supreme Court 4 months earlier in a case that began over a dispute about a right-wing attack on Hillary Clinton had already launched the family's covered spending into a new, more electorally ambitious phase. At the moment that David Cook took the stage in New York, operatives working for his brother and himself were quietly converting 30 years' worth of ideological institution building into a machine that would resemble, and rival, those of the two major political parties. Rather than representing broad-based support, however, theirs was financed by a tiny fraction of the wealthiest families in America, who could now, should they wish, spend their entire fortunes influencing the country's politics. On January 21, 2010, the court announced its 5-4 decision in the Citizens United case, overturning a century of restrictions banning corporations and unions from spending all they wanted to elect candidates. The court held that so long as businesses and unions didn't just hand their money to the candidates, which could be corrupt, but instead gave it to outside groups that were supporting or opposing the candidates and were technically independent of the campaigns, they could spend unlimited amounts to promote whatever candidates they chose. To reach the verdict, the court accepted the argument that corporations had the same rights to free speech as citizens. The ruling paved the way for a related decision by an appeals court in a case called Speech Now, which soon after overturned limits on how much money individuals could give to outside groups too. Previously, contributions to political action committees, or PACs, had been capped at $5,000 per person per year. But now the court found that there could be no donation limits so long as there was no coordination with the candidates' campaigns. Soon, the groups set up to take the unlimited contributions were dubbed super PACs for their augmented new powers. In both cases, the courts embraced the argument that independent spending, as opposed to direct contributions to the candidates, wouldn't result in corruption. From the start, critics like Richard Posner, a brilliant and iconoclastic conservative federal judge, declared the court had reasoned naively, pointing out that it was difficult to see what practical difference there is between super PAC donations and direct campaign donations, from a corruption standpoint. The immediate impact, as the New Yorker writer Jeffrey Toobin summarized it, was that it gave rich people more or less free rein to spend as much as they want in support of their favored candidates. Among the few remaining restraints that the majority of the court endorsed was the long-standing expectation that any spending in a political campaign should be visible to the public. Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the majority opinion, predicted that with the advent of the Internet, prompt disclosure of expenditures would be easier than ever. This, he suggested, would prevent corruption because citizens can see whether elected officials are in the pocket of so-called moneyed interests. The assumption soon proved wrong. Instead, as critics had warned, more and more of the money flooding into elections was spent by secretive nonprofit organizations that claimed the right to conceal their donors' identities. Rich activists such as Scaife and the Kochs had already paved the way to weaponize philanthropy. Now they and other allied donors gave what came to be called dark money to nonprofit social welfare groups that claimed the right to spend on elections without disclosing their donors. As a result, the American political system became awash in unlimited, untraceable cash. In striking down the existing campaign finance laws, the courts eviscerated a century of reform. After a series of campaign scandals involving secret donations from the newly rich industrial barons in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, progressives had passed laws limiting spending in order to protect the democratic process from corruption. The laws were meant to safeguard political equality at a time of growing economic inequality. Reformers had seen the concentration of wealth in the hands of oil, steel, finance, and railroad magnates as threatening the democratic equilibrium. The Republican William McKinley's elections in 1896 and 1900, for instance, were infamously lubricated by donations raised by the political organizer Mark Hanna from big corporations like Rockefeller's Standard Oil. In a growing backlash to the corruption, at President Theodore Roosevelt's behest, Congress passed the Tillman Act in 1907, which banned corporate contributions to federal candidates and political committees. Later scandals resulted in further restrictions limiting spending by unions and the size of individual contributions, and requiring public disclosure. By overturning many of these restrictions, the Citizens United decision was in many respects a return to the Gilded Age. Justice John Paul Stevens, a moderate Republican when first appointed but long part of the court's liberal wing, described the decision as a radical departure from what has been settled First Amendment law. In a lengthy dissent, he argued that the Constitution's framers had enshrined the right of free speech for individual Americans, not corporations, and that to act otherwise was a rejection of the common sense of the American people who have recognized the need to prevent corporations from undermining self-government since the founding, and who have fought against the distinctive corrupting potential of corporate electioneering since the days of Theodore Roosevelt. Memorably, Stevens added, "While American democracy is imperfect, few outside the majority of this court would have thought its flaws included a dearth of corporate money in politics." Most analyses attributed the about-face on these vital rules guaranteeing fair elections to the increasingly assertive conservatism of Chief Justice John Roberts's court. Clearly, this was the decisive factor. But there was a backstory, too. For almost 4 decades, a tiny coterie of ultra-rich activists who wished to influence American politics by spending more than the laws would allow, had been chafing at the legal restraints. One family had been particularly tireless in the struggle, the DeVos clan of Michigan. The family, whose members became stalwarts in the Koch's donor network, had made a multi-billion-dollar fortune from a remarkable American business success, the Amway direct marketing empire. Founded in 1959 by two boyhood friends, Richard DeVos Sr. and Jay Van Andel, in Ada, Michigan, a suburb of Grand Rapids, it sold household products door-to-door while preaching the gospel of wealth with cult-like fervor. Over time, the private company grew into a marketing behemoth, generating revenues of nearly $11 billion a year by 2011. The DeVoses were devout members of the Dutch Reformed Church, a renegade branch of Calvinism brought to America by Dutch immigrants, many of whom settled around Lake Michigan. By the 1970s, the church had become a vibrant and, some would say, vitriolic center of the Christian right. Members crusade against abortion, homosexuality, feminism, and modern science that conflicted with their teachings. Extreme free market economic theories rejecting government intervention and venerating hard work and success in the Calvinist tradition were also embraced by many followers. Within this community of extreme views, no family was more extreme or more active than the DeVoses. They were less well known outside Michigan than some of the other founding families of the conservative movement, but few played a bigger role as its bankrollers. Among the many causes they supported was the Koch donor network. Although their views on social issues were considerably more reactionary than those of the Kochs, they ardently shared the brothers' antipathy toward regulations and taxes. Amway in fact was structured to avoid federal taxes. DeVos and Van Andel achieved this by defining the door-to-door salesmen who sold their beauty, cleaning, and dietary products as independent business owners rather than employees. This enabled the company's owners to skip Social Security contributions and other employee benefits, greatly enhancing their bottom line. It resulted, however, in numerous legal skirmishes with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. In a charge that was later dropped, the government alleged that the company was little more than a pyramid scheme built upon misleading promises of riches to prospective distributors, many of whom bought its products in bulk, found themselves unable to sell them, and so were forced to cover their debts by recruiting additional distributors. The gray zone in which the company operated made its cultivation of political influence important. In 1975, after Grand Rapids' Republican Congressman Gerald R. Ford became president, the usefulness of political clout became particularly apparent. While the Federal Trade Commission investigation was ongoing, DeVos and Van Andel obtained a lengthy meeting with Ford in the Oval Office. Two of Ford's top aides, soon after, became investors in a new venture founded by DeVos and Van Andel. After news of their involvement surfaced, the White House aides dropped out, but Amway later hired one of them as a Washington lobbyist. Meanwhile, perhaps coincidentally, the FTC investigation into whether Amway was an illegal pyramid scheme fizzled, resulting only in the company having its knuckles rapped for misleading advertising about how much its distributors could earn. The company's political activism was so unusually intense that one FTC attorney at the time told Forbes, "They're not a business, but some sort of quasi-religious socio-political organization." Indeed, as Kim Phillips-Fein writes in Invisible Hands, Amway was much more than a simple direct marketing firm. It was an organization devoted with missionary zeal to the very idea of free enterprise. There were legal limits, however, to how much the DeVoses could spend on elections. In 1974, after the Watergate scandal, Congress set new contribution limits and established the public financing of presidential campaigns. Opponents struggled to find ways around the new rules. In 1976, they partly succeeded when the Supreme Court, judging a case brought by a Republican Senate candidate, William F. Buckley Jr.'s brother James, struck down limits on independent expenditures. This opened what became an ever-expanding opportunity for big donors. In 1980, Richard DeVos and Jay Van Andel led the way in independent expenditures, becoming the top spenders on behalf of Ronald Reagan's presidential candidacy. By 1981, their titles reflected their growing clout. Richard DeVos was the finance chair of the Republican National Committee, RNC, while J. Van Andel headed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In Washington, the pair cut a swath, hosting lavish parties on the Amway yacht, which was docked on the Potomac River, attended by Republican big shots and dignitaries from the dozen countries in which Amway operated. DeVos, the son of a poor Dutch immigrant, appeared as if dressed by a Hollywood costume department, flashing a pinky ring and driving a Rolls-Royce. The flood of money from Amway's founders failed, though, to quash an investigation by the Canadian government into a tax fraud scheme in which both DeVos and Van Andel were criminally charged in 1982. The scandal exploded when Kitty McKinsey and Paul Magnuson, then reporters for the Detroit Free Press, shocked readers accustomed to DeVos and Van Andel's professions of patriotism and religiosity with an exposé tracing an elaborate, 13-year-long tax scam directly to the boss's offices. At its highest levels, they revealed, Amway had secretly authorized a scheme creating dummy invoices to deceive Canadian customs officials into accepting falsely low valuations on products the company imported into Canada. Amway had thus fraudulently lowered its tax bills by $26.4 million from 1965 until 1978. Amway denounced the news reports and threatened to file a $500 million libel suit against the Free Press. But the next year, the company released a terse statement announcing that it had pleaded guilty to defrauding the Canadian government and would pay a $20 million fine. In exchange, the plea agreement called for criminal charges to be dropped against 4 of the company's top executives, including DeVos and Van Andel. In 1989, Amway paid an additional $38 million to settle a related civil suit. DeVos was soon dethroned as the RNC's finance chair. His standing hadn't been helped by his reference to the brutal 1982 economic recession as a welcome cleansing process or by his insistence that he'd never seen an unemployed person who wanted to work. Top donors were also put off by his attempts to transform RNC meetings into patriotic pep rallies akin to those run for Amway salesmen. DeVos would call wealthy contributors to the stage and ask, "Why are you proud to be an American?" A longtime Republican activist told the Washington Post, "We were losing contributions and that was the last straw." The DeVos family nonetheless remained huge financiers of the Republican Party and the growing conservative movement, as well as sponsoring efforts to undo campaign finance laws. Starting in 1970, they began to direct at least $200 million into virtually every branch of the new right's infrastructure, from think tanks like the Heritage Foundation to academic organizations such as the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which funded conservative publications on college campuses. There's not a Republican president or presidential candidate in the last 50 years who hasn't known the DeVoses. Saul Anuzis, a former chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, said. The DeVoses were also deeply involved in the secretive Council for National Policy, described by the New York Times as a little-known club of a few hundred of the most powerful conservatives in the country, which it said met behind closed doors in undisclosed locations for a confidential conference 3 times a year. Membership lists were secret, but among the names tied to the organization were Jerry Falwell, Phyllis Schlafly, Pat Robertson, and Wayne LaPierre of the National Rifle Association, NRA. There was overlap with a number of other participants in the Cook seminars, too, including Foster Friess, the multimillionaire founder of a Wyoming mutual fund, Friess Associates, who had collaborated politically with the Kochs at least since the 1996 election, when they both channeled money into Triad management to surreptitiously fund attack ads. Charles Cook accepted an award from the Council for National Policy but was not a member of the group. It was, in Richard DeVos's phrase, a place that brought together the doers with the donors. If anything, the DeVos family's brushes with the law merely emboldened them. During the 1994 midterm elections, Amway gave $2.5 million to the Republican Party, which was the largest known soft money donation from a corporation in the country's history. In 1996, Clean government groups criticized the family for skirting campaign contribution limits by also donating $1.3 million to the San Diego Tourist Bureau to help air the Republican National Convention there that year. By then, Richard DeVos Sr. had bought the NBA's Orlando Magic and had passed the management of Amway on to his son Richard Jr., who was known as Dick. The younger DeVos shared his father's political and religious views. But he was a pragmatist when it came to business, expanding the zealously free market company deeply into China. By 2006, fully a third of Amway's revenue came from the communist state. The DeVos family's stature and wealth were magnified by Dick's marriage to the other royal family of Michigan's Dutch Reformed community, Betsy Prince. Her father, Edgar Prince, had founded an auto parts manufacturing company that sold for $1.35 billion in cash in 1996. Her brother Eric Prince, meanwhile, founded the global security firm Blackwater, which the reporter Jeremy Scahill described as the world's most powerful mercenary army. Betsy DeVos, who eventually became the chairwoman of Michigan's Republican Party, was said to be every bit as politically ambitious as her husband, if not more so. With her support, in 2002 Dick DeVos ceased managing Amway in order to devote more time to his political career. The results, though, were dismal. The DeVos family spent over $2 million in 2000 on a Michigan school voucher referendum that was defeated by 68% of the voters. The family then spent $35 million in 2006 on Dick DeVos's unsuccessful bid to become the state's governor. In their zeal to implement their conservative vision, few issues were more central to the DeVos family's mission than eradicating restraints on political spending. For years, the family funded legal challenges to various campaign finance laws. Ground zero in this fight was the James Madison Center for Free Speech, of which Betsy DeVos became a founding board member in 1997. The nonprofit organization's sole goal was to end all legal restrictions on money in politics. Its honorary chairman was Senator Mitch McConnell, a savvy and prodigious fundraiser. Conservatives cast their opposition to campaign finance restrictions as a principled defense of free speech, but McConnell, who was one of the cause's biggest champions, had occasionally revealed a more partisan motive. As a Republican running for office in Kentucky in the 1970s, when it was almost solidly Democratic, he once admitted a spending edge is the only thing that gives a Republican a chance to compete. He had once opened a college class by writing on the blackboard the 3 ingredients that he felt were necessary to build a political party: money, money, money. In a Senate debate on proposed campaign finance restrictions, McConnell reportedly told colleagues, "If we stop this thing, we can control the institution for the next 20 years. The James Madison Center aimed to make this dream a reality by taking the fight to the courts. In addition to the DeVos family, early donors included several of the most powerful groups on the right, such as the Christian Coalition and the NRA. But the driving force behind the organization was a single-minded lawyer from Terre Haute, Indiana, James Bopp Jr., who was general counsel to the Anti-Abortion National Right to Life Committee. Bopp also became the Madison Center's general counsel. In fact, Bopp's law firm and the James Madison Center had the same office address and phone number, and although Bopp listed himself as an outside contractor to the center, virtually every dollar from donors went to his firm. By designating itself a nonprofit charitable group, though, the Madison Center enabled the DeVos Family Foundation and other supporters to take tax deductions for subsidizing long-shot lawsuits that might never have been attempted otherwise. The relationship between this organization and Bopp's law firm is such that there really is no charity, observed Marcus Owens, a Washington lawyer who formerly oversaw tax-exempt groups for the Internal Revenue Service. "I've never heard of this sort of captive charity/foundation funding of a particular law firm before." In 1997, the same year that she helped found the Madison Center, Betsy DeVos explained her opposition to campaign finance restrictions. At the time, there was a national outcry against the way both the Democratic and the Republican parties had evaded contribution limits in the 1996 presidential campaign by paying for what they claimed were issue ads rather than campaign ads, with unlimited funds that came to be known as soft money. There was a bipartisan Senate push for reform. But in a guest column in the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call, DeVos defended the unlimited contributions. Soft money, she wrote, was just hard-earned American dollars that Big Brother has yet to find a way to control. That is all it is, nothing more. She added, I know a little something about soft money, as my family is the largest single contributor of soft money to the National Republican Party. She said, I have decided, however, to stop taking offense at the suggestion that we are buying influence. Now I simply concede the point. They are right. We do expect some things in return. We expect to foster a conservative governing philosophy consisting of limited government and respect for traditional American virtues. We expect a return on our investment, we expect a good and honest government. Furthermore, we expect the Republican Party to use the money to promote these policies, and yes, to win elections. People like us, she concluded archly, must surely be stopped. Most of the big donors fighting the campaign finance restrictions were conservatives, but a few extraordinarily rich liberal Democrats belonged to this rarefied club, too. In 2004, Democratic-aligned outside groups spent $185 million, more than twice what the Republican outside groups spent in a failed effort to defeat George W. Bush's re-election. Of this, $85 million came from just 14 Democratic donors. Leading the pack was the New York hedge fund magnate George Soros, an opponent of the U.S. invasion of Iraq who regarded President Bush as such a scourge that he vowed he would spend his entire $7 billion fortune to defeat him, if the result could be guaranteed. With the help of Democratic operatives, Soros funneled more than $27 million into the outside spending vehicle of choice that year, known as 527 Groups. It was the same year that Republicans used the same mechanism to fund the Swift boat attacks on John Kerry. Prior to Citizens United, such schemes were legally dubious at best. The Federal Election Commission ruled that the gargantuan outside spending schemes violated campaign finance laws and imposed hefty fines on both the Democratic and the Republican perpetrators. Afterward, Soros remained active in ideological philanthropy, spending hundreds of millions to support a network of human rights and civil liberties groups, but he largely withdrew from spectacular campaign contributions. If the DeVoses expected a return on our investment in the Madison Center, as Betsy had put it, they got one in the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. It was really Jim Bop's brainchild. Richard L. Hassan, an expert on election law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, told the New York Times. He has manufactured these cases to present certain questions to the Supreme Court in a certain order and achieve a certain result, said Hassan. He is a litigation machine. Bop agreed. We had a 10-year plan to take all this down, he told the Times. And if we do it right, I think we can pretty well dismantle the entire regulatory regime that is called campaign finance law. Such a statement would have seemed ludicrous just a few years earlier, and in fact, in the beginning, no one took Bop seriously. With his shaggy gray Beatles haircut and his dogmatic legal style, not to mention his extreme views, he was literally laughed at by one federal judge. At the time, he was arguing that a hyperbolic film attacking Hillary Clinton, who was running for president, deserved the same First Amendment protection as newscasts aired by CBS's 60 Minutes. The film, a screed called Hillary, the movie, had been produced by Citizens United, an old right-wing group with a history of making vicious campaign ads. The question, as the Supreme Court interpreted it, was whether Hillary, the movie, was a protected form of speech or a corporate political donation by its backers, which could be regulated as a campaign donation. Case by case, financed by wealthy donors who treated the cause as a tax-deductible charity, Bop had battered away at the foundation of modern campaign finance law. He had succeeded in part by using the liberals' language of civil rights and free speech against their own practices. The tactic was intentional. Clint Bolick, a pioneer in the conservative legal movement whose group, the Institute for Justice, had received start-up funds from Charles Koch, had argued that the right needed to combat the left by asserting appealing counter-rights of its own. Thus Citizens United was cast as the right of corporations to exercise their free speech. As conservatives had hoped, the argument disarmed and divided the left, even attracting the support of traditionally liberal champions of the First Amendment. While polls consistently showed that large majorities of the American public, both Republicans and Democrats, favored strict spending limits, the key challenges that led to dismantling the laws were initiated by an extraordinarily rich minority, the Kochs and their clique of ultra-wealthy conservative activists. A close look at the Speech Now case, for instance, the lower court decision following quickly on the heels of Citizens United, leads right back to the same people. There was no organization called Speech Now until several libertarian activists invented it solely for the purpose of challenging the spending limits. The suit was the brainchild of Eric O'Keefe, among others, the Wisconsin investor who had been a libertarian ally of the Kochs since working in David's 1980 vice presidential campaign, which called for the end of campaign spending limits. Leading the suit was Bradley Smith, a bright and radically anti-regulatory lawyer who co-founded the Conservative Center for Competitive Politics. He was a proponent of zero public disclosure of political spending and didn't disclose his funders, but IRS records showed that in 2009 his center enjoyed support from several conservative foundations, including the Bradley Foundation. Smith's career illustrated the way that the fortunes of conservative philanthropists cultivated and nurtured talent like his. He had been a scholar at Charles Koch's Institute for Humane Studies before becoming the most outspoken foe of finance restrictions ever to chair the Federal Election Commission, the federal agency charged with policing